The member for Fredericton South and Leader of his party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise. Second reading on Bill 32, an act to amend the Gasoline and Motor Fuel Tax Act. Mr. Speaker, some years ago, all the provinces in Ottawa forged a historic agreement, the Pan-Canadian Agreement on Climate Change, intended to respond urgently to the climate crisis. The decision was taken, Mr. Speaker, to not use significant regulation to drive carbon emissions down, to reduce carbon pollution. Instead, the decision was to pursue a market-based approach, use market forces to try and drive carbon pollution down by pricing carbon, putting a price on carbon, the idea being that that price would increase year over year and would send a signal in the market to influence purchasing choices, for example, so that if you're convinced the costs are going to continue to go up of a fuel, that you will make fuel efficiency, for example, a much higher priority in your decision-making process when you replace your old vehicle. So that's kind of the theory behind it, Mr. Speaker. But the evidence from around the world has demonstrated that the most significant impact on reducing carbon pollution of putting a price on carbon is not the market signal it sends, because it's a rather small amount, really, in terms of influencing behavior and purchasing decisions, but in terms of how the revenue is used to actually help people and families and businesses and communities reduce their carbon footprint by supporting them with programs to purchase electric vehicles, to install solar power on their businesses or homes, to do deep energy-efficient retrofits on their businesses or homes, to establish community wind power for municipalities, and so on. So that actually, Mr. Speaker, as the evidence shows, is where the biggest impact of this is. So the concern that I always have about the way so far the carbon tax has been rolled out in New Brunswick is that there are no clear criteria around how the revenue will be used to ensure that it actually is having the desired effect of rapidly reducing our carbon pollution. And a very small percentage of this $163 million that will result, including the new extra $40 million that will result from this bill, is going to specifically achieve or implement the commitments of the Climate Action Plan. I mean, after you take out the amount of money that's being used to subsidize gasoline purchases, it's being used to subsidize natural gas purchases, the money that's being used to subsidize research by a nuclear company, then you are left with not that much to actually turn that money back in the forms of supports and programs for individuals, families, businesses, and municipalities to reduce their carbon footprint and reduce their energy costs at the same time. So it is the lack of criteria, Mr. Speaker, that is the issue here that needs to be addressed. It needs to be addressed so that people have faith that the government is using the carbon tax revenue that we're paying to actually reduce carbon pollution in the quickest, most efficient way possible. And, Mr. Speaker, that's not happening. That's not happening because such a small percentage of this is actually going to implement the Climate Action Plan, which is intended to do exactly that. Even Prince Edward Island, the tiniest province in the entire country, has now got a financial incentive to help people buy electric vehicles. We don't have any such thing. We don't even have yet the electric vehicle strategy that was committed to in the Climate Action Plan to lay out a roadmap as to how to grow the number of electric vehicles rapidly as part of the overall fleet, not just those that individuals drive, but those that businesses use, delivery companies use, that the government itself uses, municipal governments use. So even that very basic strategy to increase the uptake of electric vehicles, never mind any incentives around that or any other programs or regulations that might be in place that the strategy could lay out, hasn't been done. In Quebec, you know, they have requirements so that a certain percentage of vehicles on the car lots need to be electric vehicles or hybrid or plug-ins. And so that you can actually go to the car dealerships and see the vehicle, the truck, or the car, get in it, drive it, and evaluate it. And that's not very commonly available here in New Brunswick. So criteria, Mr. Speaker, in terms of how the carbon tax revenue is spent, is absolutely essential. Criteria that actually will bring about rapid reductions in carbon pollution to achieve our 2030 target in New Brunswick, our made in New Brunswick 2030 target, not Canada's target for the entire country, but our made in New Brunswick target, and that means reducing rapidly a couple of more million tons of carbon pollution in the next 9 years, Mr. Speaker. How are we going to do that unless this money is used in an effective way to actually get that carbon pollution reduced? Spending millions on research is not going to help what's going to happen in terms of what our carbon pollution numbers will be in 2030. It's not going to make a dent in it. Spending money on helping individuals, families, businesses, and municipalities reduce their demand for energy, through energy efficiency, replace the supply of energy with renewable sources, replace transportation vehicles that use fossil fuels with those that use electricity or other renewable sources of power like biogas for buses or hydrogen or even green diesel for heavy trucks or for heavy equipment in the woods. So lots of options, lots of priorities that will bring about rapid reductions in carbon pollution, Mr. Speaker, but unless the criteria are there to ensure that that's how the money gets spent, any support that exists in the support that exists for this approach, instead of regulation, is going to disappear. The alternative is to bring in significant regulation on carbon pollution of all sorts. That's the alternative to this. The premiers of the day and the Prime Minister of the day, when the Pan-Canadian Climate Change Agreement was negotiated, was to avoid that. They said, let's use market forces. That's what classical economists are telling us to do. And so that's what they did. And that's why we have this. And I might add, as far as the made in New Brunswick carbon tax goes, that is what the Standing Committee, when it came to pricing carbon, recommended in its, the Select Committee on Climate Change, all-party committee, recommended in its report from the summer of 2015, long time ago now, maybe 16, that it be made in New Brunswick. And we've got to that. It doesn't mean necessarily that it's been made in the way we would make it as Greens, but it's made in New Brunswick. So, Mr. Speaker, criteria is what we need. Whether we can add criteria to this, this bill at committee is a good question, but something worth exploring, and that is one of the issues I'll be raising at committee. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member